Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of my history of the 20th century. This time we're going to be looking at it from the periphery perspective. This is not going to make too much sense if you haven't seen part one, so please make sure you've looked at part one before you listen to this video. So, in the earlier video, we talked about the 20th century from the viewpoint of the core countries, and so I introduced you to the core periphery model. And today we're going to be talking about the peripheral countries. Now, I'm actually borrowing from Wallerstein's world systems model, which is the idea that the entire world economy is basically run by countries that would be considered part of this core, who basically exploit the other countries throughout the world. Now, what's interesting is that to bring this out, we have core countries, which have most of the money and make the most important decisions. We do have the peripheral, which are usually former colonies of the core. And then we have the semi-peripheral countries. And as you see, they're kind of in between. They take from the periphery, but they get orders from the core. And this creates the complex economy that we're in the midst of today. So when we look at those peripheral countries, what's important to note is that they are, at the turn of the century, they are being dominated by the capitalist European industrial powers, and those powers are exploiting the human environmental and resources for their benefit to grow their empires. Once those empires actually go to war during World War I, not only does the fighting spill throughout most of the world, but also members of these colonies end up fighting for the European powers. And what happens is that makes people realize in these colonies that not only is Europe not infallible, but that they are never really going to truly win the support of these colonial masters. So one of the things that these colonial masters would basically set up is that, hey, we know what we're doing, and eventually you'll be good enough and smart enough to be able to run, to become independent. And it becomes clear in the Great War, after the Great War, and people do not get their freedom and they do not get the rewards they're expecting, that they are going to need to fight for their independence. Some of the unintended consequences of World War I include Japan becoming incredibly upset, and we'll talk about that in a bit. They actually fight for the Allies and are basically given nothing for their efforts, and so they realize they're going to have to do things on their own. The economic devastation that comes from World War I is going to make it more difficult for Europeans to control their vast empires as they have to try to rebuild themselves. A worldwide depression is going to happen after about 10 years after the end of World War I, which again is going to cause doubt in capitalism and again European superiority. And the other thing that's going to happen is that ethnic groups are going to use this kind of confusion and this loosening to stir up nationalist feelings and nationalism to create their own independent countries. But before that can really get going, we then have World War II as Germany, Italy, and Japan basically start taking over vast amounts of land, and we have the Second World War. For more on that, make sure you look at part one. From the peripheral perspective, there were several unintended consequences of World War II as well. Is that while Europe was weakened after World War I, they are crippled by the end of World War II. They still have better technology, they still have more money than the periphery, but they're not going to be able to have the total control that they're used to or can try to maintain. It's going to just be way too expensive to be able to do so. What that is going to lead to is that's going to lead to that explosion of nationalism that starts before World War II. So at the end of World War II, we're going to have about 45 countries as part of the United Nations, and by the end of the 20th century, we're going to have like 200 countries. And another unexpected consequence of World War II is, of course, the Cold War, which again we talked about in the last slideshow. And because of that, a bipolar world order kind of emerges. We have the first world, which is going to be the United States and capitalism, the second world, which is going to be the Soviet Union trying to spread communism, and the third world is basically going to be everyone else who's trying to decide and are going to basically play these superpowers off each other or be played. Now, in this confusion, as Europe can no longer hold on to the colonies the way they can, we're going to need to talk about a lot of different areas. And as I was going through the different ways to do this, I realized what I'll need to do is I'll just basically take an area at a time, and I will give you just a couple slides on them. And I will take them basically from World War II to modern day. So the first area we're going to talk about is India. And so India is going to be the crown jewel of the British Empire. It's going to be a huge it's going to generate a huge amount of money for the British Empire. So by the end of the 1800s, though, it's going to be clear that many people in India are going to want to be independent and have self-rule. So they're going to start to create their Indian National Congress. Again, remember I said the European colonial masters would at least go through the facade of people being able to rule themselves. And what's going to end up happening is that after World War I, there is going to be a move to basically break away from Britain. Then what's going to happen is that the way it's going to happen is basically going to be through a man named Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi is one of the revered figures of history. Not that he was perfect, but he's going to use some very interesting and effective methods to try to get rid of the British Empire. So he's going to be a big proponent of ahimsa, or non-violence, or the idea of satyagraha, which is the passive resistance. So it's the idea of that not necessarily militarily attacking someone, but basically being just firm on what is true and that you're not going to do what they want. There's kind of two modes that this movement is going to go into. The first one is going to be a non-cooperation movement, and then the second one is going to be more of a civil disobedience movement. What's going to end up happening is, so the difference between those two is, for instance, let's say that the school has like a no hat policy. And so a non-cooperation movement might be that you show up to school in a hat, and then when I say please take it off, then you just decline to do so, which is difficult and again forces the power structure to decide how important that particular rule is. Civil disobedience means that you would show up to school without a hat, look me in the eye, take out a hat, and flat out put the hat on in front of me. That's civil disobedience. And so it's a ratcheting up of really forcing the power structure to realize, okay, is this rule worth enforcing or not? One of the other things that Gandhi does is he really encourages the boycotting of British institutions, so the British can't make as much money in India. And what's important to note is that just how heroic and how much willpower it takes to do this type of nonviolent resistance. So the reason why it is so difficult for people to follow this through is that sometimes people do get hurt. Not that they should be getting hurt, but it happens. For instance, the Amritsar massacre and other times, Gandhi would basically teach these principles of nonviolence and passive resistance, but the whole idea is like, look, if you do something against me, I'm not going to fight back. I'm not going to go along with you, but I'm not going to fight back. So even if you were to beat me up, sure, you might even beat me up, you might kill me, but although I'll be dead, you will still be wrong. And it's an incredibly powerful exercise to force the people in charge to realize, is what they're doing worth it? And it's very heroic because they aren't defending themselves in the way that you would necessarily expect. Again, it basically forces the leaders to become overbearing and monsters, and therefore it becomes clear that they should no longer be in charge. So what happens is, unfortunately, this is not an easy process. So once Britain, after World War II, they realize, okay, we got to go. We're not going to be able to do this. So as they leave, India has a problem in that they are about 75% Hindu and 25% Muslim. And even though the minority is 25%, many of those people are actually rich and are powerful. And so what they decide to do is they decide to create a partition. What the partition is they basically make parts of India for Hindus and parts of it for Muslims. So what's going to end up happening is that it's going to be an incredibly chaotic event that's going to end up happening. So the Muslims are creating an area called Pakistan to the western part of India. They are going to have another country called Eastern Pakistan. So it's going to be one country kind of on either ends of India. That Eastern Indian country we now know today as Bangladesh. So the Muslims have to move to the outside and the Hindus have to move in. And it is incredibly difficult. About 10 million people are forced to become refugees. They have to leave where they live. And there is definite violence as this is happening. It's a very chaotic time. So about 500,000 people die. The leader of India, Nehru, is going to move India towards try to move them towards a non-alignment position. He's going to try to find that third path where he does not have to be beholden to the Americans or British or capitalists, nor does he want to be beholden to the communists. And in general, India is going to do a good job of creating this third path for themselves. Today, India has become an economic powerhouse, not along the lines of the EU or the United States, but not only do they create a lot of things worth of value, but they have a highly educated population in pockets, and so the future for India looks bright if they can keep things under control. Another group that is going to take this opportunity after World War II to force their way into having an independent country is going to be the Jews. And we talked about this briefly, but what's going to happen is that anti-Semitism is going to be on the rise throughout Europe as these European empires are being built. By the 1880s, some Jews decide, well, we need to have our own country, and so they decide to move home, which at that point is called Palestine, starting about the 1880s. So as Jews start moving, some Jews start moving to this area, creating their life for themselves. World War I happens, and that area is actually under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire goes away, and Great Britain gets to be the power in charge of that area. And they find that it's a mess. Not only do they have these Jews who are insisting that they should have a homeland there, they also have obviously all of the Arabs who already lived there. So, in a decision that basically caused a lot of controversy, is that the British do something called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which proclaims that they support there being some sort of Jewish homeland in the area of Palestine. Of course, this upsets the Arabs who are living there. But in the midst of this, World War II breaks out. And as World War II breaks out, Britain again has a lot of losses and there are definitely issues. And so once that is over, Britain is eager to hand this over to the United Nations to help decide the land's fate, because both the Jews and the Arabs want it, and there's no real way to do it. So what the UN decides to do is the UN decides to divide it into 7 regions, 3 Jewish, 3 Arab, and then Jerusalem itself is such an important religious and world city that it's internationalized, and which is very important and makes a lot of sense. So, emboldened, the Jews are excited and they declare their independence in May of 1948, and they're promptly attacked by the Arabs. So basically, as the Arabs are basically driven out, and they go actually peacefully at first, but essentially, as they leave the area at first, one of the reasons they're leaving so easily is they're basically getting armed, and then they're immediately going to go back and try to take back the land. This is not the only time that Israel is going to be attacked. The other 2 major attacks you usually learn about is the Six-Day War, which will happen in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War that happens in 1973. Now, what is very odd is each time that Israel is invaded, not only do they win, but they solidify their position. In many cases, they actually gain land. And throughout this process, the United States is their most steadfast ally. So I've been talking about really from the Israeli perspective, but let me go ahead and flip it to the Palestinian perspective. And Palestinian, means basically any native of Palestine who is not Jewish. So as you can see, when we take a look at like before 1917, we have basically that all that yellow is Palestine, and it's controlled. It's controlled by the British officially. Once the Balfour Declaration is made and more Jews come in, as you can see, some of the green starts to come in to the area. Then third picture shows you what the initial UN partition plan was, how they wanted to change it. And as you can see, yeah, it's divided, but those are incredibly difficult boundaries for either side to necessarily maintain. After we have the initial attack by the Palestinians, as you can see, the Israelis solidify their land, and you can notice in that fourth image how that's uh, much more easily to control. And what happens is those borders stay relatively, and there's a lot more I could talk about, but I don't have time. But essentially, we fast forward to the present, which is in the far right, and what you'll notice is Palestine keeps shrinking and shrinking. That's one of the big contentions of what's happening, is that the Israelis are taking more and more of their land, and they're creating settlements in the area which they claim should be Palestinian land. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a hot spot today is, um, Israel on one hand is just trying to survive. On the other hand, they're taking more and more land that should be the Palestinian land. There's much more to learn about that, but unfortunately I don't have time to go through it. And partially because Israel isn't the only thing that happens in the Middle East. And during this entire time period, there's going to be a lot of turmoil that's going to happen. There's going to be different countries which at different times try to basically set themselves up as the leaders of the Arab world and try to be separate from the first and second world distinctions we've talked about. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran are the ones that come to mind off the top of our heads when we think of countries that have tried to take that leadership position. In general, there's been lots of turmoils over the decades. But there's also been a large case of there have been a lot of cases of resentment by outside forces trying to control the area. And we'll talk about why they're trying to control that in a little bit. The two biggest ones I need to make sure you know about are the Iranian Revolution, which will happen in the 70s, which basically will be a revolt against the American-backed Shah, who was modernizing Iran and was being very favorable to the United States. And the other one that we need to talk about is Afghanistan, which in the 1980s is going to be taken over by the Soviets. That is going to create a huge, difficult war that is going to lose a lot of Soviet soldiers. It's going to be in many ways kind of the Soviet Vietnam. In both cases, there's going to be heavy backing by the idea of Islam and their versions of Sharia law. So why are these other outside areas trying to get involved so much? Well, of course, a big reason has to do with the importance of oil and the amount of oil which is found in this area of the world. In the established in 1960, these countries, most of which are Arab and Muslim, form an organization called the OPEC, or Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And what they are going to do is they're going to do that to try to control the price of oil, and in some ways to try to get their way. In the 1970s, OPEC is basically going to protest the American, primarily American, interference that's been happening in the Middle East and create an oil embargo, which is going to be a very difficult couple of years for the United States. And ever since then, a rallying cry has been throughout the United States is we've got to get rid of our dependence on foreign oil because of how much that made life difficult for us in the 70s. Oil is not something that just the United States wants. Saddam Hussein in Iraq, after a long war with Iran to the east, is going to attack Kuwait, which is a small country with a lot of oil reserves, to try to get control of that oil. And essentially the world is going to come to Kuwait's aid. Partially humanitarian, but let's be honest, it was basically to make sure that Saddam didn't have control over that oil. in fact, the convergence of oil and all this outside interference is going to essentially, in some ways, culminate in the 9/11 attacks, which Osama bin Laden talked about when he talked about why it happened. It was basically a direct protest to the American interference with Middle Eastern affairs, specifically with how America has backed Israel. As you probably know, that in a way actually completely backfired. The United States became more active in the Middle East, specifically helped to rout out Saddam Hussein in Iraq and go through Afghanistan as well. Both of them are going to cost American lives, and is going to be something that we're still trying to figure out how to stabilize to this day. So I started with India and the Jews in Israel because they got their independence really quickly after World War II. The next big kind of jump I'm going to do is to the rest of Africa. And so what happens is, again, as I mentioned, the World Wars is going to encourage local rebellions and against the European domination. The other thing that's going to happen is that that colonies aren't just a one-way street. So what's going to happen is as these colonies are being controlled by the Europeans, some of the best and brightest in these colonies get to go back to the colonizing country. And so what's going to happen is some of these best and brightest from Africa are going to go to Europe, be educated, and say, wait a second, we love these liberal ideas. We love this idea of independence and sovereignty. We need this too. So what you'll notice is the map on the left, it goes through basically when did all of the countries of Africa basically get their independence. And what's important to note, a huge difference is that some of these are going to be peaceful, but some of these are going to be very difficult, are going to include wars and so on and so forth against Britain, against France. And so, unfortunately, often their independence is something that's not going to come easily from the Europeans. What you'll notice is that a lot of these countries get their independence in the early 60s. And what happens directly after that is an organization is created called the OAU, or Organization of African Unity. And it's basically formed to help these countries in Africa decide how to industrialize and become strong nations by working together. One of the big things that they decide early on, which is very important, is they decide to declare the European boundaries permanent. Now, these boundaries that the Europeans had created for their colonies were arbitrary. They were based off of the European needs and ability to control versus the actual sometimes natural resources, and oftentimes the people or cultures or languages or even sometimes religions that are within those borders. However, because there was a lot of infrastructure put into place by those European countries, they decided, okay, although these are bad, this is going to be our best shot to try to become independent, strong nations. Unfortunately, independence and especially strong countries is going to be difficult to create in Africa. One of the things that's going to happen is that, again, a lot of students, when they look at Africa, they wonder, they ask me, Mr. Hammond, why are there 50 countries? Well, the reason why there's 50 countries is so there's not 1,000. There are so many different groups, language groups and cultures within Africa. It's very difficult. If you were to give every ethnicity their own country, there would just be far too many of them. So one of the things that's going to happen is, in these arbitrary boundaries the Europeans are going to create, they're going to create a Pax Romana, because essentially these European powers are going to have better military and better technology, and so they're going to basically force peace amongst these different groups of people who find themselves in the same country. Now, that doesn't always, with the Europeans gone, that isn't always peaceful. There's going to be some incredibly bloody civil wars, and the map is going to change several times in Africa as some of these ethnicities are going to force their way to try to create either their new nations or take over their nations. One of the other issues as well is that when it comes to independence, there's going to be a lot of economic hardship. Some parts of Africa have tons of natural resources, some don't. The other issue is as these Europeans create these nations, they're going to create these nations and they're going to build the infrastructure for the European nations' benefits. And so what they're doing is that they're taking the natural resources out. And so that's going to make it difficult for the money or the worth to really stay within these nations so that they can grow stronger. And the other issue as well is the instability of the democratic regimes. A lot of these African countries are going to have been ruled by their colonial masters, and so it's not a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of experience. And so without having a strong, experienced administrative bureaucratic class of native Africans, it's going to make things very difficult. And many of these countries are going to slide from democracies into dictatorships. When it comes to the future of Africa, like I mentioned, some countries have um, a lot of natural resources already, and South Africa right now is seen as the strongest economy in Africa, partially bolstered by its massive gold and diamond resources, although they have a lot of other natural resources as well. One of the tragic things that I don't have time to really talk to you about is that South Africa also is going to be, in many ways, the most modern of the African countries because there's going to be a minority of people we're going to call Afrikaners, which are people of European ancestry who are going to live in Africa. So, yes, their parents are from, in most cases, Netherlands or Britain, but they will have lived in Africa for generations. And so, what's going to happen is they're going to bring a lot of Western ideals, just completely install them because they're going to be Western themselves. And it also creates that bureaucratic class, which I mentioned, that isn't available in most of Africa. When we're looking more towards the future, Nigeria is already an up and coming power there as well. It's got a large population, good natural resources, and many people believe within the next few decades, Nigeria is going to be a very important power there. And the other thing that's really interesting about Africa is that China has been making some huge investments in Africa to create their new Silk Road, which I'll talk about at the end of the slideshow. In some ways, Africa has already become China's China. When there's something that's too cheap with too low of a profit margin to make in China, Chinese factories and Chinese companies are starting to make those things in Africa. So we will see what happens to Africa in the future. So the countries I've talked about so far have really worked to try to not necessarily pick sides during the Cold War. And there are a few regions which just really didn't have that choice. And one of the most interesting histories has got to be Japan, which has it's a really bad, weird relationship with the United States. We've already learned how the United States forced Japan to open its ports in the end of the 1800s. And Japan responds to that humiliation by deciding to become an imperial power themselves. And through the Meiji Restoration, what they do, they create their own, they create a military. They actually beat Russia in a war. And as World War I opens, Japan eyes the German lands which are available in China, and so they join the war to try to take over those lands. So when World War I ends, Japan is expecting to get those large pieces of and important pieces of infrastructure in China, and to their shock, they don't, which causes a lot of political turmoil in Japan. The militarists and imperialists get more and more power in Japan, and they actually start World War II. You normally learn about Hitler, but essentially China's taking over Manchuria and ravaging through China is actually the start of World War II, not from a European perspective, but definitely counts from more of a broader perspective. So the country that's going to defeat Japan is their old frenemy, the United States. And so the United States goes through, there's much more to the story, but the end of it is that the United States actually drops nuclear bombs on Japan, drops two of them. And And there's a whole other discussion we can get onto whether they should or whether they shouldn't. But what is absolutely crazy is that even though the United States drops a couple of nuclear bombs um, and soundly defeats Japan, uh, the United States becomes a huge ally of Japan. They ask an incredibly amazing, bold ask. And basically, the deal that the United States gives Japan is that, look, okay, yeah, we destroyed this. You got to get rid of your emperor, but we will essentially make you a capitalist powerhouse. We're not going to allow you to have a military, but that means we'll take on the military. So we'll provide you military cover, and we're going to basically invest and help you become an economic powerhouse. And it works. Japan becomes an incredibly important part of the world economy, and is seen as in many ways, kind of the biggest success story of the Cold War. Um, and so, again, really weird international relationship. Another part of the world which really doesn't have a choice on whether they're taking sides in the Cold War is going to be Latin America. And the United States is going to have a long history of investing and interfering with Latin American politics. This map from your book shows you all of the different ones, and that's just before World War II. All sorts of incursions and investments, quote unquote, being made in Latin America. So basically, what happens in the 20th century is that, as we've already discussed in the previous slideshow, is the Great War ensures that the U.S. is going to be a dominant power in the world. One of the things that they do is they put some of their capital investments in Latin America to get more and more raw materials. Now, interestingly, between the world wars, um, FDR announces something called the Good Neighbor Policy, which essentially the Monroe Doctrine, which came before it, was that, hey, if you're messing with the U.S.'s money in Latin America, we've reserved the right to go down and interfere any way we need to. And so FDR announces, okay, he backs off of that with a good neighbor policy, and then is surprised, not more so than the American businessmen, when Mexico decides to nationalize their oil industry. So the U.S. and Britain, but primarily the U.S., had put a lot of investments in the Mexico oil industry, and they nationalize it, basically kicking out the foreigners to make money off of their own oil. So the United States has a decision to make, and so the United States FDR does decide to follow his good neighbor policy. And what this does is this really kind of shifts from the U.S. sending their actual troops down to basically backing leaders. So we're not sending people down there necessarily, or a large amount of troops, but basically what we would do is we would back whoever would back the U.S. interests. And what this does during the Cold War is allows Latin American leaders to really play the superpowers off against each other. Now, again, the United States is going to really dominate this area, but there are going to be a couple of footholds where communism is going to take root. Cuba and Venezuela. And again, like I mentioned in the last slideshow, Cuba especially provides a lot of tense moments with the United States. And that leads us with our last area, which is another one that's going to be really influenced by the Soviets, which is the Republic of China. Where we last left, China was a mess. China was in the 1800s being interfered with by all these unequal treaties with Britain, but also Germany, and also all sorts of European powers. Eventually, what's going to happen is by 1911, the Emperor Pui is forced to abdicate. He is also like 4, so don't be too hard on him. Unfortunately, a lot of political anarchy follows because not only is there a lot of internal disunity, a lot of local warlords, people trying to fight for control, we still at this point have a lot of foreign imperialists. We have Americans, Europeans, Japanese, all trying to take pieces of China. Eventually, what happens is a leader named Sun Yat-sen unifies basically the internal power structure of China, and he unifies 2 camps. He's both a capitalist and he also attracts communists as well through his party, which I'm going to say is the GMD. So he has three things here. That's his big points. Number one is his point is like there can be is nationalism. We've got to get rid of these spheres of foreign influence. Number two, we need to have a democracy, none of this emperor stuff anymore. And number three, livelihood. We need to make sure that we redistribute the land. And as you can see here, there's definite parts of communism and parts of capitalism, which you could kind of infer through this. Unfortunately, he dies. So when he dies, that causes a civil war in China. Now the two big sides are going to be Jiang Jieshi, or otherwise known as Chiang Kai-shek, who's going to actually take over, and he is going to really side with the West and with capitalism. He is going to try to drive out the communists, and so the communists are going to have to literally run away, and this is called the Long March. So they have to flee 6,000 miles, which is basically from one end of the coast to the other here in the United States. Now, what happens is during this very difficult time, a leader emerges named Mao Zedong, and he creates his own vision of Chinese communism called Maoism. And what's interesting is the communists are basically hiding in the mountains. They're on their last legs, and then the Japanese attack. So what happens is that the Japanese are attacking from the north. The base of China is in the south. So who's in between China and Japan? Well, it's going to be the communists. And what's going to end up happening is Mao and his communists are going to basically emerge as heroes after World War II for fighting the Japanese. And from there, and as you can see in this map, you can see like Japan's is taking over the orange. You'll notice the red arrows are going into these mountain areas. That's where the communists were. And what's going to happen is that Jiang Jieshi is going to make some really bad calculations. He's going to basically let those communists be the ones to fight and kind of hide behind them. And once he does that, he basically loses, for lack of a better term, the mandate of heaven of the people. Is the people see the strength of the communists and the fighting that they do, and so China becomes communist very quickly after World War II. Small problem: communism doesn't work. There are going to be some really as Mao has this very flowery and a beautiful vision of communism, it just is not going to work. We're going to have the Great Leap Forward, which is going to be a disaster and killed millions of Chinese as they try to restructure their agriculture. As that's clear that that's not working, he doubles down with something called the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which basically trying to just keep himself in charge. Takes basically the youthful, the idealist youth, basically turn them against anybody who is against Mao. And in the midst of this as well, we're also starting to get huge population surges as China already has a lot of people. As they start to begin to industrialize, of course, the death rate starts to fall, birth rate keeps up, and so there's a huge amount of people. Eventually, the Cultural Revolution dies down, and a man named Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1981. And one of the things that Mao does is basically creates kind of this closed communist system, which isn't all his idea, but we don't have time to get into it. But basically, the Soviets don't do a lot of help with China and don't provide the markets that the Chinese need. And so what happens is Deng Xiaoping starts to open little bits of China for international markets. He also decides to create the one-child policy to try to get the population under control. However, in the 80s, as you already know, the Cold War finishes with the capitalists winning. Now, in the midst of all this that's happening, we have a pro-democracy demonstration that happens in China, which we call this Tiananmen Square. And what happens is that it looks like China is going to overthrow communism. Now, communism, again, has proven it doesn't work. And these people are demanding democracy. And unfortunately, what happens is that the Chinese brutally clear out the square under the cover of night. Now, you might wonder, well, why didn't they just rise up again? Well, what they realize is the Chinese Communist Party realizes, okay, we're not going to be able to hold on to this the way things are going. And so they make a brilliant move. China is still to this day a totalitarian communist country, but what they have done is they've opened up their economy to foreign investment. Don't get me wrong, American companies don't call the shots or European countries don't call the shots. The communists are in charge, but they've opened themselves up, and so what's happened is that China has really created this booming economy, and they're not done. You can see on the bottom left is a very famous picture for Tiananmen Square. Then that, unfortunately, those tanks are going to be part of the things that drive out the people. On the bottom right, though, you can see these new Silk Roads, and one of the things that China is doing is they are creating, as over the past decade or two, they have been creating a new Silk Road, which you notice connects China all the way through the old Silk Road, all the way, including Russia and Germany. And then on the maritime routes from the Indian Ocean Trade Basin, we go down here and we're connected to India and Africa. And then we can go through into Italy as well. And of course, you can also, I've seen some pictures of it, which actually take this and move the ports over to the western side as well. Now, what is interesting about this is you'll notice there's one big superpower which isn't involved at all. That's right. So the United States is not a part of this equation, and that is very much on purpose. So it's going to be a really interesting couple decades. One of the things that's interesting about this is down here in the South China Sea, how China has literally been building islands to try to gain control of that ocean. The other thing they're doing is they're doing a lot of investing into the lesser developed countries. Unfortunately, that investment is coming with a price. Is that they're doing investments. However, some of these are actually loans that are being loaned to governments, and as these governments are unable to, if they're unable to pay these payments, then essentially China will have the legal rights to take this infrastructure which they're helping to build in these countries. So again, it's going to be a really interesting next couple decades. And that leads us to the last slide that we ended with the other slideshow too, which is this idea of a multipolar world. As you can see, the winners of the Cold War, the EU and the United States, they have, at the moment at least, they have a little bit less than 50% of the world GDP. But countries like China and Russia, India, Brazil and South Africa, they've got 22%, and that percentage is growing and growing and growing, especially as China is able to create that Silk Road. It's going to be really crazy to see how things end up happening. All right. So with that, that is the 20th century from both the core and peripheral country perspectives.